The last emperor of China was crowned before he could read, lost his empire before he could understand what an empire was, became an emperor again under a foreign army, and ended his life tending plants while tourists walked through the palace that had once called him the Son of Heaven. His name was Puyi, and perhaps the strangest thing about his life is that, for all the crowns he wore, almost none of the great decisions that shaped his existence were truly his own. Tonight, our story begins behind the enormous red walls of the Forbidden City on a cold night in Beijing near the end of an ancient dynasty. A little boy is being carried through the palace gates. He is not yet 3 years old. He has been taken from his family home and brought into a world of yellow silk, incense smoke, carved dragons, kneeling officials, echoing courtyards, and rituals older than anyone around him can remember. The adults tell him that he is the emperor, but he does not know what an emperor is. He does not understand why elderly men fall to their knees when he enters a room. He does not understand why people speak to him with lowered eyes, why he is dressed in robes far too heavy for his small body, or why his mother and father can no longer simply come and take him home. Beyond the palace walls, China is changing. The Qing Dynasty, which has ruled for more than 2.5 centuries, is weakening. Foreign powers have forced their way into Chinese ports and cities. Japan has emerged as a modern military power. Revolutionary ideas are spreading. Railways, telegraphs, newspapers, rifles, factories, and new political movements are beginning to reshape a civilization that once believed its imperial order stood at the center of the world. And in the middle of this enormous transformation sits a child on a dragon throne. He will be emperor for only a few years before the dynasty collapses. Then, in one of history's strangest arrangements, he will remain inside the Forbidden City, surrounded by servants who continue to bow before him, pretending that the old world still exists. He will grow up believing that the throne may someday return to him. He will be expelled from his palace. He will search for protection. He will place his hopes in foreign hands. And eventually, far to the northeast in Manchuria, the Japanese Empire will give him another throne. It will look like power. It will feel like destiny. But it will become another prison. Puyi will live long enough to see that kingdom collapse, to become a Soviet prisoner, to stand accused for his role in a puppet state, and to return to China not as a ruler, but as an ordinary citizen. He will learn to dress himself. He will learn to work. He will learn to move through streets where nobody kneels. And eventually, the palace of his childhood will become a museum. So allow the room around you to grow quiet. Let the modern world soften for a while. Imagine the winter air over old Beijing, the glow of lanterns beneath tiled roofs, and the distant sound of footsteps crossing stone courtyards after dark. Tonight, we will follow one small boy through the death of an empire. And we will discover how the man who was taught that he owned an entire world eventually had to learn that he had never truly owned even himself. Beijing, late autumn, 1908. Night settles early over the northern capital. The sky above the city is dark and dry, and a cold wind moves through narrow lanes where wooden gates are closing for the evening. Coal smoke hangs faintly in the air. Inside courtyard houses, families gather around small sources of warmth. Vendors disappear from the streets. Horses stamp against the cold. And at the center of Beijing stands a city inside the city. The Forbidden City. Its walls rise high and red against the winter darkness. Beyond them are halls with sweeping roofs of glazed yellow tile, ceremonial gates, marble terraces, bronze lions, stone bridges, gardens, shrines, storerooms, kitchens, offices, sleeping quarters, and endless courtyards arranged according to an ancient imperial order. For centuries, these walls have separated the ruler of China from almost everyone he supposedly rules. Only a small part of the population has ever been allowed inside. To most people, the emperor is not simply a political leader. He is the Son of Heaven, the human figure at the center of a cosmic arrangement linking heaven, earth, ancestors, seasons, ritual, government, and empire. The idea is unimaginably old. But by 1908, the empire built around it is tired. The dynasty ruling China is the Qing Dynasty, founded by the Manchus in the 17th century. From their homeland beyond the Great Wall, Manchu armies had conquered Beijing in 1644 and eventually extended imperial authority over a vast territory. At the height of Qing power, emperors such as Kangxi and Qianlong presided over one of the largest and wealthiest states in the world. Foreign envoys arrived at court. Tribute missions came from distant regions. Imperial armies campaigned across Central Asia. The population expanded dramatically. Paintings, porcelain, poetry, scholarship, architecture, and court ceremony flourished. For those standing at the center of that world, the Qing dynasty could appear almost permanent. But nothing in history is permanent. During the 19th century, pressures accumulated. European industrial powers arrived with ships and weapons that Qing officials struggled to match. The Opium Wars exposed deep military weaknesses and led to humiliating treaties. Foreign governments acquired special privileges in Chinese cities. Ports were opened under pressure. Missionaries traveled inland. Foreign merchants built communities on Chinese soil where Chinese authority was restricted. Then came enormous internal rebellions. The Taiping Rebellion alone devastated wide areas of the country and cost millions of lives. Other uprisings followed. The court attempted reforms, but reform came slowly, unevenly, and often amid resistance from those who feared that too much change would destroy the traditions holding the empire together. Then, in 1894 and 1895, China suffered another profound shock. It was defeated by Japan. For generations, many Chinese officials had regarded Japan as a smaller, neighboring civilization shaped heavily by Chinese culture. Now Japan had modernized rapidly. It possessed a reorganized army, a modern navy, industrial ambitions, and an expanding imperial vision. Its victory over Qing China was not merely a military defeat. It was a warning that the regional order itself had changed. More humiliation followed during the Boxer Crisis at the beginning of the 20th century, when foreign armies entered Beijing after violence against foreigners and Chinese Christians. Imperial institutions survived, but their aura of invincibility did not. By the first decade of the 20th century, revolutionaries were openly discussing the end of dynastic government. Students traveled abroad and returned with new political ideas. Newspapers circulated arguments about nationalism, constitutionalism, republican government, and modernization. Military units were reorganized along modern lines. Railways tied regions together in unfamiliar ways. The old order was still standing, but beneath it, the ground was moving. Inside the Forbidden City, however, change moved at a different pace. Court ceremonies continued. Officials bowed. Incense burned before ancestral tablets. Edicts were prepared with elaborate formal language. Meals were carried through corridors in large processions. Eunuchs hurried between residences. Silk robes rustled across stone floors. And within this enclosed world lived Empress Dowager Cixi, the formidable woman who had dominated Qing politics for much of the previous half-century. For decades, Cixi had survived palace intrigue, rebellion, foreign invasion, and internal political struggles. She had risen from the imperial household to become one of the most powerful figures in China. By 1908, she was elderly and gravely ill. The official emperor was her nephew, the Guangxu emperor. But Guangxu had long lived under severe restrictions after an unsuccessful reform movement in 1898. He was still emperor in title, yet real authority remained elsewhere. Then, in November 1908, the Guangxu emperor died. He was only 37 years old. His death created an immediate problem. There was no son to inherit the throne, and Cixi herself was dying. The dynasty needed an emperor. More precisely, it needed a child. A young ruler could be placed on the throne while adults governed in his name, Such arrangements had precedence in imperial history. A child could also provide continuity at a moment when the dynasty desperately needed the appearance of continuity. The child selected was Puyi. He had been born in Beijing on February 7, 1906. His father was Prince Chun Zaifeng, a member of the imperial clan and the younger half-brother of the Guangxu emperor. His mother, Yulan, came from another prominent Manchu family. Puyi was still a toddler. He had no understanding of revolution. He knew nothing of treaties. He had never studied imperial administration. He did not know about the long decline of Qing power. To him, the world was much smaller. It consisted of familiar rooms, familiar adults, familiar sounds, and the comfort of the household in which he had been born. Then imperial messengers arrived. We can imagine the atmosphere changing almost immediately. A household that had known the rhythms of aristocratic family life suddenly became part of a dynastic crisis. Orders from the palace were not ordinary invitations. When the imperial court summoned a child to become emperor, there was no meaningful possibility of refusal. Accounts of Puyi's early life describe his distress when he was taken away. At such an age, the grandeur surrounding the event could have meant very little. A child does not understand succession. A child understands separation. He knows the person whose arms feel familiar. He knows the room where he sleeps. He recognizes voices. He notices when strangers arrive. And so, one of the most consequential journeys in modern Chinese history began not with an army or a statesman, but with a frightened little boy leaving home. He was brought toward the Forbidden City. The gates opened before him, then closed behind him. Inside, the scale of everything must have seemed enormous. The palace had been built to make human beings feel small. Courtyards stretched across broad spaces of stone. Halls stood on raised terraces. Roofs rose above carved balustrades. Dragons appeared everywhere, symbols of imperial authority twisting across screens, pillars, robes, vessels, and thrones. Yellow, the imperial color, gleamed from roof tiles and silk. Red walls divided one space from another. Doors led into courtyards. Courtyards led into more gates. Gates led into more halls. To an adult court official, this architecture communicated hierarchy. To a small child, it may simply have seemed endless. Around him, people behaved strangely. Men, old enough to be his grandfather, lowered themselves before him. Servants waited for instructions he did not know how to give. His clothing changed. His surroundings changed. The manner in which people spoke to him changed. Suddenly, a child who had once belonged to a family was treated as though he belonged to an empire. There is a painful contradiction at the heart of Puyi's coronation. The ceremony raised him above almost every living person in China. At the same time, it removed almost every ordinary freedom available to a child. He could not decide where he would live. He could not decide who would surround him. He could not leave. He could not simply run home. Power had arrived before choice. On December 2, 1908, Puyi was formally enthroned as the Xuantong Emperor. The great ceremonial spaces of the Forbidden City were prepared. Officials assembled in court dress. Ritual movements were performed according to established custom. The little emperor occupied a world of banners, robes, formal proclamations, incense, drums, carved stone, and carefully rehearsed submission. Later recollections associated with Puyi describe the young child becoming frightened and restless during the ceremonies. His father attempted to comfort him. According to a famous story, when the child became upset, his father told him that it would soon be over and that they could go home. Whether every remembered word was preserved exactly is less important than the strange symbolism of the moment. The adults around the throne were trying to convince China that an ancient dynasty would continue. The child on the throne wanted to go home. The contrast could hardly have been greater. Outside the palace, the Qing government was attempting constitutional reforms. provincial assemblies were being created. New schools were replacing parts of the traditional educational system. Modern military forces were being organized. Political organizations were spreading. Revolutionary networks were becoming more sophisticated. Sun Yat-sen and other anti-Qing revolutionaries had spent years trying to organize uprisings against the dynasty. Many early attempts failed, but failure did not end the movement. Each rebellion, each exile community, each group of students, each political pamphlet, and each frustrated military officer contributed to an atmosphere that the court could no longer fully control. And the dynasty faced another problem. It was not simply seen as old. By many Han Chinese revolutionaries, the Qing was also portrayed as a foreign Manchu ruling house. For centuries, the dynasty had carefully integrated Manchu identity with Chinese imperial institutions. But in an age of nationalism, the Manchu origins of the ruling house became politically explosive. Slogans calling for the expulsion of the Manchus circulated among revolutionaries. The throne on which little Puyi sat was therefore becoming the target of forces he could not possibly understand. Yet within the palace, his life continued under layers of ritual. The emperor had attendance for nearly everything. Objects were carried for him. Food appeared before him. Doors opened. Clothing was prepared. Adults watched his movements. When he entered certain spaces, others responded according to rank. He was not being raised to discover the world. The world, in theory, was supposed to come to him. This was one of the great illusions of imperial palace life. A ruler could be treated as the center of creation, while knowing remarkably little about the ordinary reality outside the walls. For Puyi, that isolation began before he had developed any stable memory of another kind of existence. He would grow up surrounded by people whose livelihoods depended upon preserving court customs. To them, he was not merely a boy named Puyi. He was His Majesty. He was the emperor. Every bow reinforced the idea. Every ceremonial phrase reinforced it. Every forbidden doorway and special privilege reinforced it. But beneath the enormous title stood a child who remained dependent on adults for almost everything. The Emperor of China needed someone to put him to bed. He needed someone to comfort him when he was frightened. He needed familiar affection, and one of the people who provided it was his wet nurse, Wang Lianshu. For young Puyi, she became a deeply important presence. In a palace crowded with attendants, she represented something much simpler: warmth, familiarity. A human relationship that was not entirely defined by imperial ceremony. This distinction mattered. The palace could provide thousands of objects. It could provide servants. It could provide magnificent rooms. It could provide titles greater than those possessed by almost anyone on earth. But emotional security was much more difficult to manufacture. Puyi's childhood would become a strange mixture of excessive privilege and profound deprivation. He could command adults, but he could not choose the shape of his own life. He could possess beautiful things, but he could not wander through Beijing like an ordinary child. He could be told that everything under heaven belonged to him. Yet the first home he had known was already beyond his reach. Meanwhile, the adults governing in his name struggled to preserve a dynasty approaching its final crisis. After the death of Empress Dowager Cixi, Puyi's father, Prince Chun, became regent. The burden placed upon him was enormous. The Qing state needed modernization, but rapid reform threatened entrenched interests. It needed stronger military forces, yet modern armies created new centers of power. It needed revenue, political legitimacy, national unity, and diplomatic strength. And it needed them quickly. History rarely grants collapsing systems the luxury of time. In 1911, less than 3 years after Puyi's enthronement, an uprising began in Wuchang. The rebellion was not initially the result of one perfectly coordinated national plan. Like many revolutions, it grew through accidents, local tensions, existing networks, military defections, political frustrations, and opportunities suddenly recognized by people who had spent years waiting for change. Provincial governments began declaring independence from the Qing court. The revolutionary movement expanded. The dynasty turned toward Yuan Shikai, a powerful military and political figure with control over important modernized forces. Negotiations followed. Republicans wanted the dynasty removed. The court wanted survival. Military realities narrowed the possible outcomes. Within the Forbidden City, Puyi was still far too young to understand what was happening. One can imagine messengers moving more quickly through the palace. Officials speaking behind closed doors. Documents being drafted. Arguments over loyalty and survival. Reports arriving from provinces that had once obeyed imperial commands and were now rejecting them. For more than 2 centuries, Qing emperors had ruled from Beijing. Now the dynasty was dissolving around a 6-year-old boy. On February 12, 1912, the abdication of the Qing emperor was formally announced. The imperial system that had shaped Chinese political life for more than 2,000 years had reached its end. China became a republic. At least on paper, the age of emperors was over. Puyi had been emperor for a little more than 3 years. He was 6 years old. He had entered the throne room before he understood government. He lost the empire before he understood that it could be lost. Yet this was not the end of his imperial childhood. In fact, it produced one of the strangest arrangements imaginable. Under the Articles of Favorable Treatment negotiated during the abdication, Puyi and the former imperial household were permitted to retain certain titles and privileges. He was allowed to continue living inside the Forbidden City. An allowance was promised. The former emperor would be treated with a degree of ceremonial respect. And so, a republic existed outside the palace walls, while within a portion of those walls, an imperial court continued to breathe. Imagine what this meant for a child. No one sat Puyi down and allowed the old world to vanish cleanly. Instead, the old world remained around him. Servants still attended him. People still bowed. Imperial language survived. Ceremonies survived. The palace survived. The dragons survived. The robes survived. The routine survived. Only the empire itself had disappeared. It was as though an enormous theater continued performing after the audience had gone home. Inside the Forbidden City, the young Puyi could still wake each morning surrounded by evidence that he was special. Outside, railway stations, military headquarters, newspaper offices, foreign concessions, merchant districts, schools, revolutionary organizations, and republican institutions belonged to another China. 2 realities stood side by side. Between them rose the palace walls. For the young former emperor, those walls now served 2 purposes. They kept the modern world out, and they kept him in. In later years, Puyi would remember his childhood with a mixture of bitterness, embarrassment, nostalgia, and self-examination. Memory is never perfect, especially when it concerns early childhood. But the broad shape of his experience is unmistakable. He was raised in an environment that magnified his importance while restricting his understanding. He was surrounded by adults who treated him as sacred while controlling nearly every practical part of his existence. He had lost his formal throne. Yet almost everyone he saw continued to act as though he still possessed it. This contradiction would shape him deeply. For how does a child learn what is real when every person around him participates in a fiction? How does he learn humility when older men kneel at his feet? How does he understand loss when nobody is willing to admit that something has truly been lost? And how does he prepare for an ordinary life when he has never been allowed to experience one? These questions would follow Puyi long after childhood. They would follow him into adolescence. They would follow him beyond the palace gates. They would follow him to Tianjin. They would follow him into Manchuria. They would follow him onto another throne. And eventually, they would follow him into a prison cell. But for now, the story remains inside the Forbidden City. The revolution has happened. The emperor has abdicated. China has officially become a republic. And still, in quiet palace rooms beneath golden roofs, a little boy continues to be dressed like a monarch. Morning light enters through carved windows. Eunuchs cross the courtyards. Bowls of food are arranged. Doors open at his approach. Adults lower their heads. Somewhere beyond the walls, the new republic argues about what China should become. But inside, the clocks seem to move differently. Puyi has lost a country he never understood. He still possesses a palace he cannot leave. And gradually, the glittering halls around him will become the only world he knows. The throne has already been taken away. The illusion has not. And in many ways, that illusion will prove far more difficult to escape. In the years after the Qing Dynasty disappeared, Puyi continued to wake beneath golden roofs. Outside the Forbidden City, flags changed. Governments changed. Generals rose and fell. Newspapers argued about constitutions, nationalism, modernization, and the future of China. But inside the palace walls, morning still arrived according to older rhythms. Before sunrise, the enormous courtyards lay quiet beneath a pale Beijing sky. The glazed yellow tiles on the roofs slowly caught the first cold light of day. Ravens moved between ancient trees. In winter, frost gathered along stone railings and marble steps. During summer, warm air settled beneath the deep eaves, carrying the faint scent of dust, flowers, old timber, and stagnant water from bronze vessels placed throughout the palace grounds. Then the Forbidden City began to wake. Doors opened. Footsteps crossed courtyards. Eunuchs moved through corridors carrying clothing, water, food, documents, boxes, and messages. Servants prepared themselves for the daily performance of monarchy. And somewhere within this enormous palace complex, a small boy opened his eyes. The empire outside had ended. But the emperor inside was still expected to behave like an emperor. This strange arrangement shaped nearly every part of Puyi's childhood. He lived in a republic while being raised according to the habits of a vanished dynasty. He was no longer sovereign over China, yet inside the walls, he remained surrounded by people who called him Your Majesty. They bowed. They waited for permission to speak. They avoided addressing him as an equal. They preserved rituals that suggested the old hierarchy remained intact. To a child, repetition becomes reality. If every adult around you kneels, you may eventually believe kneeling is the natural way adults behave. If every servant obeys your smallest demand, you may assume obedience is simply part of the order of the world. And if everyone calls you the Son of Heaven, it becomes difficult to imagine yourself as merely one human being among millions. This was the education Puyi received long before books could correct it. His world was carefully arranged around him. Meals provide one of the clearest examples. An imperial meal was not simply food. It was ceremony. Numerous dishes could be prepared, even when the young emperor would eat only a small amount. Bowls, plates, soups, meats, vegetables, sweets, and delicacies were brought forward with elaborate attention. The quantity was partly practical, partly traditional, and partly theatrical. An emperor was not supposed to appear limited by appetite. Abundance itself was a symbol. Yet there was something deeply lonely about such abundance. An ordinary child might sit close to parents or siblings and reach toward a shared dish. Puyi ate within a system built around distance. Food arrived because servants carried it. People watched him eat because watching the emperor was part of their duty. The meal might be enormous. The company was not intimate. His clothing was similarly complicated. Imperial robes were not simply garments. Colors, symbols, fabrics, and designs carried meaning. Dragons represented sovereignty. Yellow signified imperial privilege. Season, ceremony, occasion, and rank could influence what was worn. For generations, the Qing court had refined a visual language designed to make hierarchy visible. The result was magnificent. But for a child growing inside it, magnificence could become routine. There is a peculiar sadness in becoming accustomed to splendor before learning what ordinary life looks like. Puyi could grow bored in rooms that visitors would have considered astonishing. He could become impatient with treasures collected across centuries. He lived among carved jade, embroidered silk, lacquered furniture, porcelain, paintings, clocks, bronze vessels, ancient books, and objects once reserved for the most powerful household in China. And still, he was a child. Children want to run. They want to discover. They want companionship. They want to touch things they are told not to touch. They want to know what lies beyond the next doorway. For Puyi, there were always more doorways. The Forbidden City contained hundreds of buildings and vast enclosed spaces. To a young boy, it could become an entire universe. He wandered through courtyards surrounded by high red walls. He entered rooms where light filtered softly through papered windows. He passed beneath painted beams decorated in blue, green, red, and gold. He saw bronze incense burners darkened by age. He heard the soft movement of robes in corridors. During rain, water fell from the curved edges of palace roofs and struck the stones below. During winter, snow transformed the red walls and golden roofs into a quiet landscape of white. In spring, blossoms appeared in the imperial gardens. Cypress and pine trees stood among rock formations, pavilions, and old pathways. It was beautiful. And beauty can still be a prison. For beyond those walls lay a city Puyi barely knew. Beijing was alive with noises he did not regularly hear. Street vendors called to customers. Donkeys pulled carts. Rickshaws moved through crowded roads. Shopkeepers opened wooden shutters. Students gathered in schools. Soldiers marched beneath new flags. Foreigners moved through diplomatic districts and concessions. Tea houses filled with conversation. New ideas passed from hand to hand through newspapers and pamphlets. Electric lights, automobiles, telephones, modern weapons, photography, and Western clothing were gradually entering urban life. The world was becoming faster. Inside the palace, time often seemed ancient. Puyi could look toward a gate and know that another China existed beyond it. But knowing that a world exists is different from being allowed to enter it. His isolation was not merely geographical. It was emotional. His parents did not live with him as ordinary parents live with their children. Court protocol placed distance between them. His father, Prince Chun, occupied an awkward position after the fall of the dynasty. He had once served as regent for his young son. Now he belonged to an imperial family that had lost political power but retained social status and complicated relationships with the new order. Visits could occur. Family members remained part of Puyi's life. But his existence had already been reorganized around the palace. The Forbidden City was his home. The court was his household. Servants became the adults he saw most often. Among them, eunuchs formed one of the most distinctive groups. For centuries, eunuchs had served within Chinese imperial palaces. They carried messages, maintained buildings, supervised household arrangements, guarded access to private spaces, handled objects, managed supplies, and performed countless other duties. Some became enormously influential. Others lived obscure lives of service. By Puyi's childhood, the institution was already a relic of an older political world. Yet inside the Forbidden City, large numbers of eunuchs remained. To the young emperor, they were everywhere. Some indulged him. Some feared him. Some manipulated him. Some stole from the palace. Some entertained him. Some became targets of his anger. His relationship with them helped create habits that he would later regret. A child with unchecked authority quickly learns that anger can produce immediate results. If Puyi became irritated, a servant could be punished. If he wanted an object, someone found it. If he disliked an answer, the person giving it could suffer. There were few natural consequences. No ordinary schoolyard existed where another child could simply refuse to obey him. No group of classmates could laugh at his arrogance and remind him that he was not the center of everything. He lived within an artificial social environment where almost nobody could safely tell him no. The result was predictable. Puyi could be cruel. He later acknowledged this. The knowledge that his word could cause pain gave a dangerous sense of control to a boy who, in deeper ways, controlled almost nothing. This is one of the central contradictions of his childhood. He possessed extraordinary power over individual servants. Yet he had no power over the structure of his own life. He could punish a eunuch. He could not leave the palace. He could demand a toy. He could not choose to live with his mother. He could order an attendant across a room. He could not order history to restore his empire. Small authority became compensation for enormous helplessness, and the palace encouraged the illusion. One of the most painful moments of his early childhood came when his wet nurse, Wang Lianshu, was removed from him. She had been one of his strongest emotional connections to the life he had known before becoming emperor. For years, she remained close to him. Then court officials decided that he had grown too old to continue depending upon her. The decision may have appeared reasonable within palace custom. For Puyi, it was devastating. She was sent away. Once again, adults decided that a familiar person should disappear from his world. Once again, his imperial status gave him no meaningful control over the separation. The boy who was theoretically above everyone could not keep one beloved caretaker beside him. Such experiences deepened the emotional distance surrounding him. Puyi gradually learned that people could vanish. Palace life was filled with servants, but servants could be replaced. Faces changed. Officials came and went. Political circumstances shifted. Affection existed inside a system where hierarchy always remained present. Even family tragedy reached him strangely. In 1921, when Puyi was 15, his mother died. Her death came after a conflict involving the imperial household and members of Puyi's family, and accounts traditionally describe her as having taken opium after being deeply humiliated. For a young man already shaped by emotional separation, the loss added another layer to a childhood defined by institutions more than intimacy. Yet even grief occurred beneath ceremonial roofs. The palace continued. Meals arrived. Servants bowed. Lessons resumed. This was perhaps one of the most unsettling qualities of the Forbidden City. It could absorb almost anything. Dynasties could collapse beyond the gates. Relatives could die. Governments could change. And still, the courtyards remained. Stone does not mourn. Roof tiles do not understand revolution. The architecture continued to tell Puyi that imperial life was permanent, even as evidence of its fragility accumulated everywhere. His education reflected the same tension. Traditional tutors taught him the Chinese classics and the expectations of an imperial gentleman. He studied texts associated with Confucian learning. He learned calligraphy. He encountered histories, moral principles, political ideas, and the cultural inheritance that generations of rulers had been expected to understand. But his education took place after the institution for which it had been designed was gone. It was as if someone were carefully teaching a young captain how to command a ship that had already sunk. Still, there were people around Puyi who believed restoration was possible. The Qing Dynasty might have abdicated, but monarchist hopes had not disappeared. China's early republican years were unstable. Political authority fragmented. Military leaders competed. Presidents and cabinets changed. Regional armies gained influence. The promise of a stable republic remained difficult to realize. To royalists, this instability appeared to prove that the old order might return. And for a brief moment, it did. In the summer of 1917, a military leader named Zhang Xun entered Beijing with forces loyal to the idea of restoring the Qing monarchy. Puyi was 11 years old. Suddenly, after years of living as an emperor only within the palace, he was informed that he was emperor again in a political sense. Imperial proclamations appeared. Old symbols were revived. The young Puyi was placed once more at the center of a restoration he had not created. For those around him who dreamed of returning the Qing to power, it must have seemed like history reversing itself. But the restoration lasted only days. Opposition formed rapidly. Military forces moved against Jiangxun. Aircraft were used during the conflict around Beijing, an unsettling symbol of how far the modern world had moved beyond the ancient rituals of the palace. Before long, the restoration collapsed. Puyi was emperor once more. Then he was not. Again, adults had changed his status. Again, powerful men had used his title. Again, the throne had appeared and disappeared without his consent. The episode left behind a dangerous lesson. Restoration, however unlikely, was not impossible. If it had happened once, even for a few days, perhaps it could happen again. This hope would remain somewhere within Puyi for years. Meanwhile, another influence began changing his view of the world. Puyi became increasingly fascinated by foreign objects and Western technology. Mechanical clocks had long fascinated Qing rulers. The imperial collection contained elaborate European timepieces brought by diplomats, merchants, and missionaries across generations. Puyi inherited this curiosity. But now the West was no longer represented only by decorative objects in palace rooms. It represented modernity, eyeglasses, bicycles, telephones, automobiles, Western clothing, new hairstyles, photography, modern education. The world beyond the walls appeared energetic and strange. Puyi wanted pieces of it. He learned to ride a bicycle inside the palace grounds. The image is almost symbolic enough to feel invented. A former emperor riding a modern bicycle through ancient courtyards. Two worlds meeting beneath the same yellow roofs. But even this simple activity revealed the nature of his environment. Traditional thresholds across palace gateways made cycling inconvenient. According to accounts, some were altered or removed so the young Puyi could ride more easily. For centuries, architecture had dictated movement. Now the palace itself was being modified for a boy on a bicycle. Small changes were entering the old world. Puyi also became interested in wearing glasses. His eyesight was poor, but some conservative members of the court resisted the idea because spectacles seemed inappropriate for an emperor. The question sounds trivial today. It was not trivial inside the symbolic universe of the palace. An emperor's appearance belonged partly to ritual. Even something as practical as correcting his vision could become a debate between tradition and modernity. Eventually, spectacles became part of Puyi's familiar appearance. They also became a quiet sign that the ceremonial child was becoming an individual with tastes of his own. As adolescence approached, he experimented increasingly with Western styles. He became curious about foreign names and foreign customs. He would eventually choose the English name Henry. Yet no amount of Western clothing could solve his deeper problem. He knew more and more about the outside world. He still did not belong to it. The gates remained. The walls remained. And behind them, objects disappeared. The imperial household was expensive. Management was chaotic. Corruption was widespread. Treasures collected by generations of emperors could quietly vanish into private hands. Puyi became increasingly suspicious that eunuchs were stealing valuable objects. His suspicion was justified to a considerable degree. Antiques, paintings, books, porcelain, and other valuables could be removed and sold. The old palace, once the symbolic center of one of the greatest empires on earth, was slowly being consumed from within. Puyi attempted inspections. He tried to establish greater control. Tensions increased. Then, in 1923, fire broke out in the palace. The blaze destroyed important buildings and collections. The exact cause became a matter of suspicion. Puyi believed that theft might have been concealed through deliberate destruction. Whether every suspicion was correct or not, the incident transformed his relationship with the eunuchs. Soon afterward, he ordered large numbers of them expelled from the Forbidden City. It was a dramatic break with centuries of palace tradition. One ancient institution was suddenly swept away from his immediate household. For Puyi, it may have felt like an assertion of independence. But independence remained incomplete. He was approaching adulthood. He had begun making choices. He had discovered modern objects. He had become suspicious of the people surrounding him. He had seen a restoration rise and collapse. And still he had barely experienced ordinary China. Imagine standing late in the evening somewhere within the palace grounds. The visitors of today are absent. There are no cameras, no ticket booths, no crowds moving through the gate of supreme harmony. Only darkness, lantern light, and the outlines of old roofs beneath the night sky. A young Puyi might hear distant sounds from beyond the wall. A bell, a carriage, perhaps a vehicle, perhaps voices too far away to understand. Everything outside seems close enough to imagine, yet impossibly distant. The Forbidden City had once been designed to protect the mystery of imperial power. For Puyi, it protected something else. An illusion. The illusion that the Qing world was merely sleeping. The illusion that the bows of servants reflected the judgment of China. The illusion that titles could preserve a reality already erased by revolution. And because the illusion was protected by walls, it could survive much longer than it should have. But another person was about to enter Puyi's life. A tall Scottish scholar would walk through the old imperial gates carrying books, Western manners, political curiosity, and knowledge of a world Puyi had never been permitted to see directly. His name was Reginald Johnston, and under his influence, the former emperor would begin looking beyond the red walls with new eyes. He would learn that the world was much larger than the Forbidden City, that kings could live under constitutions, that young men could travel, that people could choose their clothing, cut their hair, ride bicycles through ordinary streets, and speak to others without demanding that they kneel. For the first time, the cage would become fully visible to the person living inside it. And once Puyi understood that he was imprisoned by the very traditions that told him he was supreme, the palace would never feel quite the same again. By the time Puyi entered adolescence, he had already lived through more political transformations than many rulers experienced in an entire lifetime. He had been crowned emperor. He had lost the throne. He had remained inside the imperial palace. He had briefly been restored. He had lost the throne again. And through all of it, he continued to live behind the red walls of the Forbidden City. This strange existence created a young man who stood between two worlds. One world was ancient. It spoke through ritual, robes, ancestral tablets, dynastic memory, formal bows, and the quiet certainty that the emperor occupied a place unlike that of ordinary human beings. The other world was modern. It moved through newspapers, trains, electric lights, new political movements, foreign languages, automobiles, cameras, telephones, schools, armies, and ideas that had little patience for sacred kingship. Puyi belonged fully to neither. He was too deeply shaped by the palace to become ordinary, and he was too aware of the outside world to remain completely satisfied with the palace. This tension would define the next stage of his life. In 1919, a new tutor entered the Forbidden City. His name was Reginald Fleming Johnston. He was Scottish, educated, widely traveled, and already experienced in Chinese affairs. He had worked in the British colonial service and had spent many years in China. Now he had been invited to become tutor to the young former emperor. To Puyi, Johnston was unlike most of the men around him. He did not belong to the old imperial court. He did not come carrying the same habits of obedience. He represented something distant, modern, and intriguing. Through Johnston, the outside world became more than a collection of objects. It became a system of ideas. Puyi studied English. He learned about European history. He read about foreign governments. He encountered accounts of constitutional monarchies, parliaments, modern diplomacy, science, geography, and international politics. The effect was gradual, but profound. For the first time, someone inside the palace was helping him understand that kings and emperors did not all live as he did. Some monarchs traveled. Some spoke with ministers who were not ceremonial servants. Some lived under constitutional limits. Some appeared in public. Some wore ordinary military uniforms or Western suits. Some were photographed among their people. The emperor did not necessarily have to be hidden behind walls. This idea fascinated Puyi. It may also have disturbed him. The more he learned, the more unnatural his own life must have seemed. He began adopting Western habits. He wore spectacles. He developed an interest in Western clothing. He experimented with hairstyles. He chose the English name Henry, inspired by English kings he had encountered in his studies. There was something youthful in this. A teenager inside an ancient palace was creating another version of himself. Not the Xuantong emperor, not the son of heaven, but Henry Puyi, a young man who might wear a suit, who might speak English, who might ride a bicycle, who might imagine traveling abroad. Yet his new identity was still surrounded by old walls. He could study maps of distant countries. He could not simply decide to visit them. He could learn about modern cities. He could not wander freely through Beijing. He could imagine the lives of people his own age. He had almost no idea how such people actually lived. This gap between knowledge and experience became increasingly painful. The forbidden city no longer seemed merely beautiful. It began to seem confining. The courtyards that had once formed his entire universe now appeared repetitive. The gates became barriers. The walls became visible as walls. In childhood, a cage can feel like the whole world. Only after learning what lies beyond it does the cage become unbearable. Johnston did not simply teach Puyi facts. He became an important advisor and companion. Their relationship was complicated, shaped by culture, politics, imperial nostalgia, and personal affection. Johnston treated Puyi with respect, but he also exposed him to ideas that challenged the more rigid traditions of the old court. Through conversations with his tutor, Puyi learned more about the unstable political environment beyond the palace. And unstable it certainly was. The Chinese Republic created in 1912 had not brought immediate peace. Yuan Shikai, who had played a decisive role in negotiating the Qing abdication, became president. He later attempted to establish himself as emperor. His imperial experiment failed quickly. After his death in 1916, central authority weakened further. Military leaders controlled different regions. Governments in Beijing changed rapidly. Political alliances formed and collapsed. Armies marched in and out of the capital. China entered the period commonly known as the warlord era. For Puyi and the people around him, this instability carried a dangerous message. The republic did not look permanent. If presidents could fall, if generals could seize Beijing, if one military faction could replace another, then perhaps history had not truly decided the fate of the Qing Dynasty. Perhaps restoration remained possible. This hope was encouraged by royalists. Former officials, Manchu nobles, conservative scholars, political opportunists, and others continued to imagine ways of bringing the dynasty back. Some were motivated by loyalty, some by nostalgia, some by personal interest. Some simply believed monarchy offered more stability than the fractured republic. Around Puyi, these voices mattered. They told him that he was not merely a retired monarch. He was the legitimate ruler waiting for history to correct itself. For a young man raised from infancy to believe that his identity was inseparable from the throne, such ideas were difficult to resist. Puyi did not have to invent the dream of restoration. Others preserved it for him. They spoke of loyalty. They spoke of destiny. They spoke of the ancestors. They spoke of the chaos outside the palace as proof that Republican government had failed. And with every such conversation, the lost throne became less like a memory and more like a promise. The problem was that Puyi had almost no direct experience of political power. He had been emperor, but not a governing emperor. He had received honors, but not responsibility. He understood symbols much better than institutions. He knew what a throne looked like. He knew less about what it meant to govern millions of people with competing interests, regional identities, economic struggles, foreign pressures, and political demands. This would become one of the great vulnerabilities of his life. He desired power without fully understanding its machinery. And people who did understand that machinery would repeatedly use his desire. Meanwhile, his private life was changing. Like other young men of his social class and background, Puyi was expected to marry. But an imperial marriage was not simply a matter of affection. It involved family status, court considerations, tradition, and politics. In 1922, when Puyi was 16, preparations were made for his marriage. Several young women from noble Manchu families were considered. Eventually, 2 were selected. Wanrong became empress. Wengxiu became a secondary consort. The wedding restored for a moment something of the grandeur of the old court. Silk, processions, formal dress, ceremonial objects, traditional rites. The palace once again looked like the center of an empire. But the empire was gone. The young bride entered not a living dynasty, but an elaborate remnant of one. Wanrong was educated and interested in modern culture. She learned English. She played the piano. She enjoyed photography. She could present herself in Western clothing as well as traditional dress. In another life, perhaps she and Puyi might have formed a modern aristocratic couple moving through a changing China. But the circumstances around them were anything but ordinary. Their marriage existed inside a palace shaped by surveillance, hierarchy, expectation, and emotional distance. Puyi himself had grown up without healthy models of intimacy. He understood ceremony better than closeness. He understood status better than partnership. He had learned that relationships could be arranged, servants could be commanded, and affection could disappear without warning. These habits followed him into adulthood. The marriage would eventually become unhappy. But in these early years, it also offered another glimpse of a world beyond childhood. Puyi was no longer the frightened toddler on the throne. He was becoming a young man. He had a wife. He had his own tastes. He had opinions. He had access to foreign books and advisors. He increasingly wished to control his own surroundings. He also became more determined to investigate theft within the palace. The imperial collections were immense. For generations, emperors had accumulated paintings, manuscripts, jade, porcelain, jewelry, bronzes, robes, clocks, religious objects, and gifts from foreign governments. Now, the institution responsible for protecting those objects was decaying. Officials and servants could exploit confusion. Treasures disappeared. Puyi became convinced that valuable objects were being stolen and sold. He attempted to examine inventories. He challenged members of the household. His distrust deepened. Then came the fire of 1923. Flames tore through part of the palace complex. Buildings burned. Collections were destroyed. Smoke rose above roofs that had survived revolution, invasion, and dynastic collapse. For Puyi, the fire seemed almost symbolic. The old world was consuming itself. He suspected that people involved in theft might have set the blaze to destroy evidence. Whether this was true in every detail remains uncertain. But the incident strengthened his determination to act. He dismissed many eunuchs from palace service. The decision was extraordinary. The eunuch institution had existed in Chinese imperial courts for centuries. Now, a teenage former emperor, living inside the ruins of monarchy, was removing many of the very people who had once defined palace life. For a time, Puyi may have felt that he was finally becoming master of his own household. Yet the larger political reality remained beyond his control. The privileges granted to the former emperor in 1912 had depended on political agreements. Agreements can be broken. And outside the palace, armed factions continued to struggle over Beijing. Puyi's status existed only so long as powerful people were willing to tolerate it. He understood this intellectually. But emotionally, the walls still encouraged a sense of protection. Inside, he possessed servants, guards, ritual prestige, and the appearance of independence. Outside, generals fought. The Forbidden City seemed separated from the disorder, but the separation was becoming fragile. In 1924, another political shift transformed Beijing. A military conflict between rival warlord factions ended with Feng Yuxiang gaining control of the capital. Feng was a powerful and unpredictable figure. He had little reason to preserve the old imperial arrangements. To him and his allies, the presence of Puyi inside the Forbidden City was more than an eccentric historical leftover. It was a political risk. As long as a former emperor remained in the old imperial palace surrounded by loyalists, monarchists possessed a symbol around which they could organize. The memory of the 1917 restoration had demonstrated the danger. The solution was simple. Remove the symbol. On November 5, 1924, representatives of the new authorities arrived. Puyi was informed that the old articles of favorable treatment were being revised. His privileged residence in the Forbidden City was ending. He would have to leave. The young man who had spent almost his entire remembered life inside the palace was suddenly being told that the palace no longer belonged to him. There was little time. There was no long farewell ceremony. No imperial procession. No formal abdication surrounded by ritual. No grand assembly of ministers. The moment was bureaucratic, abrupt, and humiliating. Orders were given. Possessions were gathered. People hurried. Puyi was frightened. The palace that had imprisoned him was about to be taken away. And now, in a final irony, he wanted desperately to remain inside it. This is the strange nature of familiar prisons. Their walls restrict us, but they also define the boundaries of the known world. Puyi had dreamed of freedom. Now, freedom arrived in the form of armed men telling him to leave his home. He moved through rooms where he had grown from toddler to young adult. Perhaps every doorway carried a memory. Here, a tutor had waited. There, servants had bowed. In another room, ceremonial robes had been prepared. Somewhere nearby, his wet nurse had once comforted him. Somewhere else, he had received news that he was emperor again. Then not emperor again. He passed treasures inherited from people whose portraits and tablets had taught him that the dynasty represented an unbroken lineage. He looked towards roofs under which generations of Qing rulers had lived and died. The stones were the same. The political meaning of every stone had changed. Then came the gates. For most of his life, they had prevented him from entering the ordinary world. Now he was being forced through them. Beyond lay Beijing, not the symbolic capital of imperial maps. The real city. Dusty streets. Vehicles. Soldiers. Merchants. Foreigners. Shop signs. Crowds. People who did not bow. People who might recognize him. People who might not care who he was. For the first time, the young former emperor entered that world not as a visitor returning safely to his palace, but as a man without a palace to return to. Behind him stood centuries of imperial ritual. Before him stood modern China. Puyi had spent years believing the walls of the Forbidden City were keeping him from freedom. He was about to discover that they had also been keeping reality away. Once outside, every weakness in his upbringing would become dangerous. He did not know how to live like an ordinary citizen. He did not understand money in an ordinary way. He had little experience making practical decisions without attendance. He had no profession. He had no independent political base. But he still possessed something that many powerful people valued: his name, his lineage, his symbolic connection to the Qing Dynasty. His existence alone could suggest legitimacy to anyone hoping to build a new political arrangement in northern China. And so the moment Puyi became physically freer, he also became politically more vulnerable. He would move first into the home of his father. Then, seeking greater security, he would enter the foreign-controlled world of the diplomatic quarter. Soon, he would leave Beijing. He would settle in Tianjin. There, surrounded by foreign concessions, restaurants, automobiles, clubs, fashionable clothing, political agents, royalist advisors, and whispered promises, Puyi would begin to imagine that losing the Forbidden City was not the end. Perhaps it was only the beginning of his return. The dream of restoration, carefully preserved through his childhood, would follow him out through the Red Gates. And beyond those gates, there were people waiting who understood exactly how useful such a dream could be. For years, Puyi had been an emperor without an empire. Soon, another empire would offer him a country. But it would not truly be his. On the afternoon Puyi left the Forbidden City, Beijing did not stop to mourn an emperor. There were no bells ringing across the capital. No army gathered to salute him. No ministers stood beneath embroidered banners. No crowds filled the streets to watch the last son of the Qing Dynasty depart from the palace his ancestors had ruled for generations. The city simply continued. Carts moved along the roads. Vendors called from shop fronts. Soldiers guarded intersections. Smoke rose from kitchens. People hurried through the autumn air carrying parcels, baskets, newspapers, and private worries of their own. And somewhere among them, a young man who had once been told that all under heaven belonged to him was discovering that he no longer possessed even the house in which he had grown up. Puyi was 18 years old. He had lived behind the walls of the Forbidden City for nearly 16 years. Now the gates closed behind him. For almost his entire remembered life, those gates had represented confinement. As a child, he had imagined the world outside with curiosity. Later, under the influence of Reginald Johnston, foreign books, Western clothing, bicycles, and stories of modern life, he had begun to think of the palace as a cage. He had resented its rules. He had resented its servants. He had resented the rituals that made every ordinary action complicated. He had dreamed of movement. And now, when the cage was finally opened, he did not feel free. He felt exposed. This is one of the quiet ironies that shaped Puyi's life. The Forbidden City had restricted him, but it had also protected him from reality. Behind its red walls, everyone knew how to behave around him. Everyone understood the language of hierarchy. There were rules for approaching him, addressing him, serving him, and leaving his presence. Outside, there were no such guarantees. A shopkeeper did not have to kneel. A soldier did not have to lower his eyes. A politician did not have to care about the Qing ancestors. A newspaper could criticize him. A crowd could ignore him. For the first time, Puyi had entered a world where his title did not automatically organize the room. He initially went to the residence of his father, Prince Chun. It should have felt like a return to family. In reality, nothing in Puyi's life could return so simply. He had been taken from his parents as a small child. Years of palace separation had reshaped their relationships. His father was not merely a father. He was a former regent. Puyi was not merely a son. He was a former emperor surrounded by political significance. Even domestic spaces carried the weight of history. And Puyi did not feel secure. Beijing in 1924 remained politically unstable. The authority that had removed him from the Forbidden City might change again. Another military faction might enter the capital. Royalist supporters might attempt to use him. Republican enemies might decide that keeping a former emperor nearby was too dangerous. Rumors moved quickly. Every visitor could carry information. Every political shift could become a threat. Puyi's advisors began considering where he might be safer. One possibility offered something Puyi had long found attractive: foreign protection. For decades, foreign powers had established special privileges within China through unequal treaties and military pressure. In certain districts and concessions, Chinese authority was restricted. Foreign diplomatic compounds enjoyed unusual protections. To Chinese nationalists, these areas represented humiliation and the erosion of sovereignty. To Puyi, at that moment, they could also represent safety. He eventually took refuge in the Japanese legation in Beijing. The decision was significant. It did not yet mean that Puyi had surrendered his future to Japan, but it moved him closer to a power that would later shape his destiny more completely than he understood. Japan had watched developments in China carefully. Its interests in Manchuria were already substantial. Japanese officials, military officers, intelligence agents, businessmen, and political strategists understood that the former Qing emperor possessed symbolic value. Puyi was a Manchu. His dynasty had originated in the northeast. If political circumstances ever required a figurehead connected to Manchu identity or Qing legitimacy, he could become useful. For the moment, however, Puyi was still searching for stability. Soon he left Beijing for Tianjin. The move must have felt like entering another civilization. Tianjin was one of the most internationally influenced cities in China. Foreign concessions created districts with different architectural styles, police arrangements, clubs, businesses, and social worlds. European buildings stood beside Chinese neighborhoods. Modern streets carried automobiles and rickshaws. Restaurants served foreign food. Imported goods appeared in shop windows. Music drifted from hotels and social clubs. Telephones rang. Newspapers circulated. Bankers, diplomats, businessmen, soldiers, missionaries, refugees, aristocrats, spies, and political agents all passed through the city. For a man raised in the enclosed ceremonial stillness of the Forbidden City, Tianjin must have seemed unusually alive. Puyi settled first in the Jiang Garden and later in the Garden of Serenity, known as Jingyuan. Here, life changed visibly. He wore Western suits. He entertained guests. He posed for photographs. He used telephones. He became increasingly interested in modern consumer goods. He could drive or be driven through streets filled with ordinary traffic. He could hear conversations that were not filtered through the ceremonial language of the palace. In outward appearance, the former emperor was becoming a modern gentleman. But beneath the suits and spectacles, the old dream survived. Puyi had not truly accepted that his imperial identity belonged only to the past. In Tianjin, royalists continued visiting him. Former Qing officials came. Manchu nobles came. Political intermediaries came. Foreign representatives came. People arrived with advice, rumors, plans, promises, and schemes. Some were sincere. Some were nostalgic. Some were opportunists. Many understood that Puyi wanted one thing above all others: restoration. If they wished to influence him, they needed only to keep that possibility alive. Puyi listened. He had spent his youth being told that the Republic was temporary. Now, the instability of China appeared to confirm those lessons. Regional militarists still competed. Governments changed. Nationalist forces were rising in the south. Communist organization was beginning to grow. Foreign powers continued to hold privileges on Chinese soil. The country remained divided by political rivalries. To Puyi, this disorder could be interpreted in a very particular way. Perhaps China had not rejected the Qing Dynasty permanently. Perhaps China had simply lost its way. Perhaps one day a strong movement would invite him back. This hope made him vulnerable. It also placed pressure on his personal life. His household in Tianjin was no longer the vast court of the Forbidden City, but many imperial habits continued. He expected deference. He continued to treat himself as a monarch in waiting. His wife Wan Rong and his secondary consort Wang Xiu lived within a marriage that became increasingly strained. From the outside, they could look glamorous. Photographs from this period show elegant clothing and carefully arranged appearances. Puyi in a Western suit. Wanrong stylish and poised. The former imperial household adapting itself to the modern age. But photographs preserve surfaces. They do not reveal silence across a room. They do not show resentment. They do not record emotional distance. Puyi's marriages suffered from the same deeper difficulties that had shaped his childhood. He had never learned ordinary intimacy. He had been taught command before partnership. He had been surrounded by attendants rather than equals. And now, the people closest to him lived inside the consequences of that upbringing. Wangxiu eventually reached a decision almost unimaginable within traditional imperial culture. She wanted a divorce. In 1931, she separated from Puyi. For the former emperor, the event was deeply humiliating. A consort had not merely left him. She had challenged the assumption that imperial status placed him beyond ordinary rejection. Newspapers reported on the dispute. The private embarrassment of the former son of heaven became public news. Once, court secrets had remained behind palace walls. Now, the modern press could discuss his marriage. The world had changed. Puyi felt that change personally. Around the same time, a far larger crisis was developing to the northeast. Manchuria was becoming the center of Japanese expansion. The region was vast and strategically important. It contained agricultural land, coal, iron, railways, cities, and industrial potential. Japan had acquired important rights and interests there after earlier wars and agreements. Its Kwantung Army guarded Japanese-controlled railway zones and became increasingly independent and ambitious. Many Japanese military officers believed Manchuria was essential to their country's security and future power. They wanted stronger control. On September 18, 1931, an explosion occurred along a section of the South Manchuria Railway near Mukden, today known as Shenyang. The damage was limited, but the incident became the justification for a major Japanese military operation. The Kwantung Army moved rapidly. Chinese forces were pushed aside across large areas. Within months, Japanese control spread over much of Manchuria. The event would become known as the Mukden Incident. For China, it was a national crisis. For Japan, it opened the path toward the creation of a new political entity. And for Puyi, it opened the door he had spent years waiting beside. Japanese officers and intermediaries began approaching him more seriously. The promise was carefully designed. Manchuria was the homeland of the Manchus. The Qing Dynasty had emerged from this region before conquering China in the 17th century. What place could be more appropriate for Puyi to begin restoring his ancestral authority? Japanese representatives suggested that a new state might be created. Puyi could play a central role. He could return to the land of his ancestors. Perhaps, eventually, the Qing monarchy itself might be reborn. This was precisely the language most likely to reach him. Puyi was not completely unaware of the risks. He had advisors who warned him. His father, Prince Chun, was cautious. Others understood that the Japanese military was not offering power out of affection for the Qing dynasty. Japan had strategic interests. A restored Puyi could provide legitimacy to Japanese expansion. His name might help persuade outsiders that the new political arrangement was based upon local Manchu aspirations rather than foreign occupation. The former emperor was valuable because he looked like continuity. But Puyi wanted to believe. That desire mattered more than warnings. For years, he had sat in Tianjin waiting for history to summon him. Now, someone had arrived saying history was ready. The invitation was intoxicating. He began secret preparations to leave Tianjin. The journey itself carried the atmosphere of political intrigue. Puyi departed under Japanese protection and made his way north. His movement was not presented as an ordinary train trip by a private citizen. He was being transferred as a political asset. The farther he traveled from Tianjin, the closer he moved toward a future from which escape would become increasingly difficult. Outside the windows, landscapes passed. Villages, fields, railway stations, winter skies, industrial towns, tracks stretching toward the northeast. Puyi may have imagined the journey as a return, a Manchu emperor going back toward the land from which his ancestors had once emerged. But history was not repeating itself. When the Qing founders moved south centuries earlier, they commanded armies. Puyi was moving north under the protection of another country's army. That difference contained the truth of everything that followed. In early 1932, the Japanese-sponsored state of Manchukuo was proclaimed. Puyi was installed not initially as emperor, but as chief executive. Even this disappointed him. He had expected restoration of monarchy. Instead, he received an official title designed to fit the political image Japan wished to create. He had a residence. He had staff. He had ceremonies. He had official documents. He had guards. But he quickly discovered that formal position and actual authority were different things. Japanese advisors remained close. Military representatives monitored important decisions. Government institutions were shaped under Japanese influence. Puyi could make suggestions. Others decided what truly mattered. The pattern of his life was returning in another form. As a child in the Forbidden City, adults had ruled in his name. Now, as a grown man in Manchuria, foreign officers would govern behind his title. The scenery had changed. The structure had not. And yet Puyi continued hoping. Perhaps this was only temporary. Perhaps cooperation with Japan was necessary for the moment. Perhaps once his position was secure, he could gain greater independence. Perhaps once monarchy was restored, he could rebuild the Qing Dynasty. Perhaps Japan needed him enough that he could eventually negotiate as an equal. These hopes allowed the arrangement to continue. 2 years later, in 1934, the moment he had long desired finally arrived. Puyi was crowned Emperor of Manchukuo. He took the reign title Kangde. Once again, he wore imperial robes. Once again, rituals surrounded him. Once again, officials bowed. Once again, proclamations declared a new imperial beginning. To the outside eye, it could look like the return of the last emperor. A man driven from his palace had found another throne. A dynasty thought dead seemed to flicker briefly back into life. But there was something colder beneath the ceremony. The throne did not stand on independent power. The army surrounding it was not truly his. The state beneath it had been created under foreign military occupation. The advisors around it answered to interests larger than his own. Puyi had dreamed for years of escaping the humiliation of being an emperor without an empire. In Manchuria, he finally received an empire. But the price was that the empire did not belong to him. The golden cage of the Forbidden City had been made of tradition. The new cage would be made of strategy, surveillance, and military power. Its walls were harder to see. Its doors were more carefully guarded. And because Puyi had entered it willingly, it would take him much longer to understand that he was trapped. He had spent years believing the day he left the Forbidden City was the day his old life was stolen from him. In time, he would realize something more painful. That departure had not ended his imprisonment. It had merely changed the people holding the key. When Puyi became emperor again, the ceremony looked convincing. There were uniforms. There were flags. There were official seals. There were ministers standing in carefully arranged lines. There were speeches about destiny, restoration, order, and the beginning of a new age. And once again, men bowed before him. For a person who had spent most of his adult life dreaming of the return of monarchy, the moment should have felt like victory. But victory has a particular sound. It usually sounds like doors opening. For Puyi, the doors were closing. In 1934, the former child emperor of the Qing Dynasty became emperor of Manchukuo. The state had been created in Manchuria under overwhelming Japanese military influence after the occupation that followed the Mukden incident of 1931. To its supporters, Manchukuo was presented as a new and independent country. Its propaganda spoke of harmony among different peoples. It had ministries, laws, schools, a currency, a flag, a bureaucracy, and a capital in the city, then known as Helsinki, today Changchun. On paper, it possessed the appearance of sovereignty. In practice, the most important power rested with Japan, and especially with the Kwantung Army. Puyi stood at the center of this contradiction. He was sovereign in ceremony. He was subordinate in reality. He had wanted a throne. Japan had given him one. But the throne had been placed inside a structure built by someone else. This is what made the arrangement so effective. Puyi did not need to be forced into every decision. His own ambitions had already brought him there. He had spent years believing that restoration was his destiny. The Japanese military had not created that belief. It simply discovered how useful the belief could be. The ancestral connection made the offer especially powerful. The Qing Dynasty had been founded by the Manchus. Manchuria therefore carried emotional and historical meaning for Puyi. Here was the homeland of the people from whom his dynasty had emerged. Here, perhaps, the fallen house could begin again. Puyi could imagine himself not as a puppet, but as a restorer. A patient monarch accepting temporary assistance until his authority became secure. Perhaps the relationship with Japan would change. Perhaps one day he would rule independently. Perhaps Manchukuo would become the first step towards something larger. Perhaps the Qing Dynasty might eventually return to Beijing. The word perhaps can sustain a human being for a very long time. It can also keep him inside a prison. The capital of Puyi's new state was very different from the Beijing of his childhood. There were no vast red walls enclosing an ancient imperial city. No halls that had watched dynasties rise and fall across centuries. No quiet courts covered in old stone. Xinqing was a city being transformed with modern imperial ambition. Broad roads were planned. Government buildings appeared. Railway lines carried soldiers, officials, workers, settlers, goods, and raw materials. Japanese planners imagined Manchuria as a modern industrial frontier. Factories expanded. Mines were developed. New neighborhoods emerged. Administrative buildings reflected a strange mixture of modern monumental architecture and references to East Asian tradition. To Puyi, the surroundings may have seemed both impressive and unfamiliar. This was not the inherited palace world of the Qing. It was a new political stage, and he was expected to perform upon it. His palace in Manchukuo did not possess the same ancient majesty as the Forbidden City. Yet ritual was carefully constructed around him. A court emerged. Officials appeared in prescribed dress. Ceremonies were organized. Photographs were taken. State visits were planned. Proclamations were issued in his name. His image appeared as part of the political identity of the state. The appearance of monarchy was useful. It suggested legitimacy. It suggested continuity with the region's Manchu past. It suggested that Japan had not simply conquered Manchuria, but had assisted in the creation of a new order under a local ruler. Puyi's face became part of that message. And yet, when important decisions were made, the limits of his authority became difficult to ignore. Japanese advisors were placed throughout the government. Senior officials operated under close supervision. The Kwantung Army possessed decisive influence. Policies involving security, diplomacy, industry, military organization, and strategic priorities were shaped according to Japanese interests. Puyi could sign. Puyi could appear. Puyi could speak. But the machinery did not truly answer to him. He had become something far more complicated than a powerless prisoner. A powerless prisoner understands his chains. Puyi was given enough ceremony to keep alive the feeling that he might someday become free. This made his position psychologically dangerous. He could convince himself that compliance today might produce independence tomorrow. When Japanese officials restricted him, he could interpret it as temporary. When they ignored his wishes, he could believe he simply needed more time. When decisions were made without him, he could imagine that future authority would correct the imbalance. The throne became a promise that renewed itself every morning. Puyi was no longer a child. He could see some of what was happening. He resented Japanese control. At times, he attempted to assert his own preferences. He disliked being treated as an ornament. He wanted appointments to reflect his wishes. He wanted ceremonial respect to become political authority. He wanted to believe that the Japanese had restored him because they recognized his legitimacy. But officials around him had other priorities. They required cooperation, not independence. Japanese representatives could control access to information. They could monitor contacts. They could shape appointments. They could pressure his household. Military power remained unmistakably on their side. Puyi's imperial residence became another enclosed world. This cage did not look like the Forbidden City. It had telephones, modern offices, Western furniture, motor cars, uniformed guards, documents produced by a modern bureaucracy. But surveillance gave the place a cold quality. Puyi could not easily know who was reporting his words. A conversation might travel beyond the room. A private frustration could reach Japanese officials. A household appointment could become political. Even family life existed under the shadow of the state. His relationship with Wanrong had already deteriorated badly. The woman who had once entered the Forbidden City as a young empress now lived in a deeply unhappy and isolated environment. In Manchukuo, her position became increasingly painful. She had the title of empress. But like Puyi's own title, it did not provide freedom. Her marriage lacked warmth. Her surroundings were controlled. Her personal choices narrowed. Over time, she became dependent on opium. The dependency deepened. The elegant young woman once photographed in fashionable clothing became increasingly fragile. Her story forms one of the quiet tragedies inside Puyi's larger tragedy. She too had entered imperial life as a very young person. She too had been given status instead of ordinary freedom. And she too would be damaged by a court that seemed magnificent from a distance. There were further personal crises. Puyi had no children. For a man raised in a dynastic tradition, this carried special significance. An emperor was not merely an individual. He belonged to a line. Inheritance mattered. Succession mattered. The continuation of the house mattered. Japanese authorities also understood the political importance of succession. Questions of marriage, heirs, and the future of the imperial household could therefore become entangled with questions of control. Even the private body of the emperor belonged partly to politics. This had always been true in monarchies. In Manchukuo, it carried an additional layer. Puyi feared that Japan wanted the future dynasty shaped according to Japanese interests. His distrust grew. Yet distrust did not lead to escape. Where would he go? Return to China? By then, many Chinese regarded him as a collaborator. Return to the life of a private citizen. He had spent his entire existence resisting precisely that possibility. Challenge Japan directly? He had no army independent of Japanese control. No secure political base. No great popular movement prepared to defend him. The man who had wanted sovereignty found himself dependent on the very power that prevented him from possessing it. Outside the palace, Manchuria was being transformed with extraordinary speed and considerable suffering. Japanese investment developed industry and infrastructure. Railways expanded. Cities grew. Industrial production increased. But development served an imperial system. Land, labor, resources, policing, and political life were shaped by occupation and colonial power. Resistance was suppressed harshly. Armed groups fought Japanese and Manchukuo forces. Security campaigns affected rural communities. Prisons filled. Military authority penetrated daily life. As the 1930s advanced, Manchukuo became increasingly integrated into Japan's wider imperial project in East Asia. In 1937, full-scale war erupted between China and Japan. Battles spread across enormous areas. Cities fell. Refugees fled. Civilian populations suffered terribly. The war transformed the political meaning of Puyi's position even further. He was no longer simply the former Qing emperor living under Japanese protection. He was the emperor of a Japanese-sponsored state while Japan fought a devastating war against China. The gap between his dream of restoration and the reality of collaboration became harder to conceal. Yet inside his residence, ceremony continued. This is one of the unsettling features of political theater. A banquet can proceed while people suffer beyond the windows. Uniforms can be polished. Flowers can be arranged. Music can play. A ruler can receive reports written in careful language. And the machinery producing suffering can remain far enough away to feel abstract. Puyi had always been protected from ordinary reality by layers of attendance and ceremony. Manchukuo preserved this habit. He saw officials. He saw documents. He saw guards. He saw diplomatic guests. But he did not live the lives of farmers whose villages became battlegrounds. He did not work in factories under military-industrial demands. He did not experience the insecurity of ordinary families caught between occupation, resistance, taxation, policing, and war. His world remained enclosed. This distance would later become central to his own reflections on responsibility. During these years, Puyi made official journeys. One of the most important took him to Japan. There he was treated with elaborate respect. He met Emperor Hirohito. Ceremonies reinforced the impression that he was a sovereign meeting another sovereign. To Puyi, such moments could be intoxicating. Publicly, he seemed to stand beside one of the most powerful monarchs in Asia. Flags flew. Officials saluted. Photographers recorded the occasion. But symbolic equality concealed political dependence. When the ceremonies ended, Manchukuo still relied upon Japanese military power. Puyi still could not shape the fundamental direction of his own state. The contradiction sharpened as Japan's war expanded. By the early 1940s, conflict stretched across the Pacific and much of East and Southeast Asia. Japan attacked Western colonial possessions and the United States. Its empire expanded dramatically. Then the direction of the war began to change. Japanese forces suffered defeats. Supply lines weakened. American industrial power grew. Bombing campaigns intensified. The Soviet Union remained a looming presence to the north. For Puyi, the distant war gradually became a personal threat. If Japan lost, what would happen to him? His throne existed because Japanese military power supported it. Without that power, the entire structure might disappear. The answer was obvious and frightening. So Puyi remained tied to Japan not merely by ambition, but increasingly by survival. He had once imagined Japan as the instrument that would restore him. Now, he needed Japan simply to prevent everything around him from collapsing. That change reveals how completely his dream had turned against him. The throne he believed would make him independent had made him more dependent than ever. He was watched by Japanese officials, bound to Japanese military fortunes, distrusted by many Chinese, separated from ordinary political life, trapped inside a household filled with suspicion, and surrounded by ceremonies that reminded him every day of the power he did not possess. Imagine him late at night in Shinking. The government buildings have gone quiet. Cars no longer arrive at the entrance. The corridors are dim. Somewhere outside, guards remain at their posts. Perhaps snow has begun to fall across the city. Manchurian winters can be severe. Cold settles deeply into streets and rooftops. Inside, Puyi sits in rooms decorated for an emperor. There may be official documents nearby. There may be portraits, uniforms, gifts, ceremonial objects, and the signs of rank. If someone enters, that person may still bow. If a proclamation is issued tomorrow, it may still carry Puyi's name. But beyond the walls, armies move according to orders he does not give. Trains carry soldiers he does not command. Factories produce for a war he does not control. Foreign policy is decided according to interests he cannot overrule. The emperor can command a servant to move a chair. He cannot command the empire supporting his throne to change direction. And slowly, beneath all the ceremony, he must have begun to understand. He had not returned to the world his ancestors had lost. That world was gone. The Qing Dynasty was gone. The Forbidden City was gone from his life. The childhood rituals were gone. The restoration he had imagined had never truly occurred. Instead, he had accepted a replica. A throne with the shape of sovereignty, but none of its foundation. A crown whose weight remained real, even when its power did not. The first golden cage of Puyi's life had been built around him before he could speak. The second was different. He had walked into it himself. And now, as the war moved toward its final years, the empire that built this second cage was beginning to crack. When it finally broke, there would be no graceful abdication, no negotiated articles of favorable treatment, no palace in which he could continue pretending. This time, the world around Puyi would collapse in days. The Japanese Empire would retreat. The Soviet army would cross into Manchuria. Officials would burn papers and abandon offices. Trains would fill with frightened passengers. Aircraft would wait on crowded runways. And the emperor of Manchukuo would discover that when a puppet state loses the hand holding its strings, the puppet does not become free. It simply falls. By the summer of 1945, the throne beneath Puyi had begun to disappear before he had even stepped down from it. The war that had once seemed distant was now approaching Manchuria with terrifying speed. For years, Puyi had lived inside a political structure that depended upon Japanese power. As long as the Japanese Empire remained strong, Manchukuo could continue to present itself as a state. Its ministries could issue orders. Its officials could wear uniforms. Its flags could fly above government buildings. Puyi could sign documents as emperor. Ceremonies could continue. Guards could stand outside his residence. Visitors could bow. But beneath all of these visible symbols lay a simple truth. Manchukuo survived because Japan was able to defend it. And by 1945, Japan was losing the war. Across the Pacific, Japanese forces had been driven back from island after island. American aircraft were striking the Japanese home islands. Shipping losses had crippled supply routes. Cities were being bombed. Fuel was scarce. Military resources were exhausted. The great expansion that had seemed unstoppable only a few years earlier had reversed. Inside Puyi's palace, the consequences arrived gradually. Reports became more troubling. Conversations became more guarded. Officials behaved differently. Rumors passed quietly between rooms. The certainty that had surrounded Japanese authority began to weaken. Puyi had spent much of his life watching powerful systems pretend to be permanent. He had seen the Qing Dynasty do it. He had seen the early Chinese republics struggle to do it. He had seen warlords enter Beijing as though each new government might last. Now he was watching another empire insist upon confidence while the foundations beneath it trembled. There was one force in particular that everyone in Manchuria watched carefully: the Soviet Union. For years, Japan and the Soviet Union had maintained an uneasy neutrality agreement. The border between Soviet territory and Japanese-controlled Manchuria remained heavily militarized. Earlier clashes between Japanese and Soviet forces had demonstrated the danger of direct confrontation. But by 1945, the wider strategic situation had changed. Germany had surrendered in Europe in May. the Soviet Union could now turn greater attention toward Asia. At the conferences between the Allied powers, Soviet entry into the war against Japan had already been discussed. Most people inside Manchukuo did not know the precise diplomatic timetable, but the possibility of Soviet attack hung over the region. For Puyi, the uncertainty was deeply personal. If Soviet forces entered Manchuria, what would happen to him? The answer could not be separated from his political record. He had accepted the leadership of a state created under Japanese occupation. He had served first as chief executive and then as emperor. He had appeared beside Japanese leaders. His name had been used to legitimize the regime. Whatever he believed about his lack of real authority, the outside world would not necessarily view him only as a prisoner. He might be treated as a collaborator, perhaps as a war criminal, perhaps as something worse. The palace that had once felt confining now began to feel fragile. Puyi reportedly became increasingly anxious during the final years of the war. His life had already been marked by suspicion. Now fear intensified it. Who could be trusted? What would Japanese officials do if defeat became inevitable? Would they protect him? Would they abandon him? Would they take him to Japan? Would Chinese forces capture him? Would Soviet troops arrive first? The emperor who had wanted power now found himself thinking not about governing, but about escape. His private world was also deteriorating. Wanrong's condition had become severe. Years of isolation and opium dependence had damaged her health. Their marriage had long since become distant. The household contained little of the intimacy that the title of imperial family might suggest. Puyi had other women around him over the years, including Liu Qin, who became one of his consorts during the Manchukuo period. But emotional stability remained elusive. The court was filled with rank. It was not filled with peace. Outside the residence, war reshaped daily life across the region. Manchuria had become deeply integrated into Japan's military economy. Industry produced steel, chemicals, machinery, weapons, and other material essential to war. Railways carried resources. Labor was mobilized under harsh conditions. Security authorities watched for resistance. Prisoners and civilians could be subjected to brutal treatment. The region also became associated with some of the darkest activities of the Japanese wartime system, including the notorious biological warfare program of Unit 731. Puyi did not control such operations, but they belonged to the political world over which he formally presided. This distinction between formal title and actual authority would later become central to how he understood and explained his responsibility. He had not directed the Japanese Empire, but he had lent his name to the state that helped sustain it. In August 1945, the long period of uncertainty ended suddenly. On August 6th, an atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. 3 days later, on August 9th, another atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. And in the hours between those two attacks, the Soviet Union entered the war against Japan. Soviet forces launched a massive offensive into Manchuria. The scale and speed of the attack were overwhelming. Armored columns advanced. Aircraft struck targets. Infantry crossed borders. Japanese defenses, weakened by years of war and transfers of experienced forces elsewhere, were unable to stop the assault effectively. The Kwantung Army, once one of the most feared military institutions in East Asia, began to collapse. For years, that army had been the hidden foundation of Puyi's throne. Now its authority dissolved with astonishing speed. News reached Xinjiang. The Soviets were advancing. The Japanese were retreating. Government offices prepared to evacuate. Documents were destroyed. Officials packed belongings. Families searched for transport. Rumors multiplied faster than reliable information. The orderly appearance of Manchukuo vanished. The state had been built through military power. When that power disappeared, the political structure around it began falling apart almost immediately. Puyi was moved away from the capital. The imperial household headed south toward Tonghua and then toward Linjiang, closer to the Korean border. The journey bore no resemblance to the grand imperial processions of Chinese history. There were no carefully planned roads cleared for the Son of Heaven, no immense banners, no ceremonial guards stretching into the distance, no tribute delegations waiting beside the route. This was flight. People carried luggage. Valuables were packed. Officials worried about vehicles and fuel. Information remained uncertain. The emperor moved because the army that had created his state was moving. At some point during these days, the truth became impossible to avoid. Japan was going to surrender. On August 15th, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's recorded voice was broadcast to the Japanese people announcing acceptance of the Allied terms. For many listeners in Japan, it was the first time they had ever heard their emperor's voice. Across the Japanese Empire, the announcement brought disbelief, relief, grief, confusion, and fear. For Puyi, it meant the end of Manchukuo. There was no power left to support his throne. No military victory could rescue him. No diplomatic maneuver could preserve the state. The restoration dream that had followed him since childhood had reached its final collapse. Puyi formally abdicated. Once again, he ceased to be an emperor. He had been made emperor as a toddler in 1908. He had abdicated as a child in 1912. He had briefly been restored in 1917. He had become ruler of Manchukuo in 1932. He had been crowned emperor there in 1934. Now, in 1945, the title disappeared for the last time. There would be no fourth throne. But Puyi still hoped to escape the consequences of the third. Plans were made to reach Japan. He traveled toward Mukden, the city now known as Shenyang, where an aircraft might carry him out of Manchuria. The imperial household could not all accompany him. The chaos of surrender divided people quickly. Families separated. Servants were left behind. Those who had once shared the elaborate life of the Manchukuo court now faced the uncertainty of occupation, capture, or flight. Puyi reportedly carried valuables with him. Jewelry, precious objects, portable wealth. A man who had once lived, surrounded by entire halls, filled with imperial treasures, was now reducing his world to what could be carried. The symbolism was almost painfully clear. The Forbidden City had contained centuries. Now history had been compressed into luggage. When Puyi reached the airfield at Mukden, he was no longer moving through his own state. The political order around him had ceased to function. Japanese officers were surrendering. Soviet forces were arriving. Aircraft, vehicles, military personnel, luggage, and frightened travelers turned the airfield into a place of confusion. There was no grand final defense of the throne. No loyal army formed a protective square around the emperor. No dramatic last stand occurred beneath imperial banners. The end came with paperwork, transport, armed guards, and exhausted people trying to understand which authority now controlled the ground beneath their feet. Puyi intended to board an aircraft and travel toward Japan. He never made it. Soviet troops took control of the airfield. The former emperor was captured. Consider how different this moment was from his first coronation. In 1908, he had been carried into a palace. Around him stood elaborate ritual. Adults knelt. The throne waited. The child understood almost nothing about what was happening. Now he was 39 years old. He had lived long enough to understand danger. No one was kneeling. No one was proclaiming him the Son of Heaven. He was surrounded not by incense and silk, but by soldiers, aircraft, engines, luggage, weapons, and the disordered remains of a defeated state. The man who had once been told that he stood above ordinary law was now a prisoner. The transformation was complete. Or so it might have appeared. But Puyi's story was not finished. He was taken into Soviet custody and transported out of Manchuria. Eventually, he would be held in the Soviet Union. His circumstances there would surprise him. He feared immediate execution or harsh punishment. Instead, as a politically valuable prisoner, he received comparatively comfortable treatment. He had meals. He had shelter. He retained some personal possessions. He was questioned. He became useful as a witness. In 1946, Puyi was taken to Tokyo to testify before the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. There, the former emperor described the control Japan had exercised over him in Manchukuo. His testimony emphasized coercion. He presented himself as someone manipulated by Japanese military power. There was truth in that description. Japan had indeed controlled the most important dimensions of Manchukuo. But truth in Puyi's life was rarely simple. He had also desired restoration. He had gone to Manchuria willingly despite warnings. He had accepted titles. He had participated in ceremonies. He had remained emperor for more than a decade. He had both been used and allowed himself to be used. The two realities could exist at the same time. This complexity is part of what makes Puyi's life so revealing. History often prefers clean categories: hero, villain, victim, collaborator, ruler, prisoner. Puyi moved uneasily through all of them. He was a victim of circumstances created before he could understand them. He also made choices as an adult. He had little real power in Manchukuo. But little power is not the same as no responsibility. Later, he would be forced to confront precisely this distinction. For now, however, his principal concern was survival. As the Chinese Civil War resumed after Japan's defeat, Puyi watched events from Soviet custody. Nationalist and communist forces struggled for control of China. Once again, his homeland was being remade without him. He had no throne, no army, no government, no palace, no meaningful constituency capable of restoring him. The dream was finally dead. Yet another transformation waited. In 1949, the Chinese Communist Party emerged victorious on the mainland. The People's Republic of China was proclaimed in Beijing on October 1st. The city where Puyi had once been worshipped as emperor now belonged to a revolutionary state founded upon the rejection of the social and political order he represented. For Puyi, the development was alarming. He feared being returned to China. He reportedly hoped to remain in the Soviet Union. At one point, he sought the possibility of staying there. The irony was striking. A man who had once dreamed of regaining China now feared being sent home. But the decision was not his. In 1950, Soviet authorities transferred Puyi and other prisoners to the new People's Republic of China. He crossed back into the country of his birth under guard. No one prepared a palace. No former officials lined the road. No restoration committee waited. The People's Republic did not see him as an emperor. It saw him as a war criminal who required investigation and reform. Puyi was sent to the Fushun War Criminals Management Center in northeastern China. There, another set of gates closed behind him. These gates were very different from those of the Forbidden City. There were no golden tiles, no dragon throne, no eunuchs, no imperial kitchens, no bowing courtiers. Inside, Puyi received something he had almost never experienced. He became one man among other men. He would have to follow schedules created for everyone. He would have to care for his own belongings. He would have to examine his past. And perhaps most difficult of all, he would have to confront the possibility that the story he had told himself for decades was incomplete. For most of his life, Puyi had explained his suffering through the actions of others. The court had taken him from his family. The Republic had removed his dynasty. Feng Yuxiang had expelled him from the Forbidden City. Japanese officers had manipulated him. Soviet troops had captured him. There was truth in every one of these statements. But prison would ask a different question. What had Puyi himself done? It was a question no emperor had ever been expected to answer. And in the quiet years ahead, beneath a roof without dragons, the last emperor of China would begin the slow and painful work of discovering an identity that did not depend upon a throne. The world he had spent his life trying to recover was gone. For the first time, there was nowhere left to return, only forward. In 1950, when Puyi returned to China, nobody bowed. There were no yellow robes waiting for him, no carved dragons, no palace musicians, no officials announcing the arrival of the Son of Heaven. The man who had once occupied the highest ceremonial position in China stepped back onto Chinese soil as a prisoner. He was 44 years old, and for perhaps the first time in his life, nearly every symbol that had protected his old identity was gone. He was no longer the emperor of the Qing Dynasty. He was no longer the ruler of Manchukuo. He was no longer a political guest of the Soviet Union. He was simply Puyi, a detainee in the custody of the People's Republic of China. The new government sent him to the Fuxin War Criminals Management Center in Liaoning Province in northeastern China. It was a place created for people accused of having participated in the Japanese occupation and the governments that had supported it. Former officials of Manchukuo were held there. Military officers were held there. Men who had once occupied positions of rank and privilege now lived behind walls under supervision. Puyi entered among them, and immediately his old habits became visible. For most of his life, other people had taken care of the smallest details of his existence. Servants had dressed him. Servants had prepared his meals. Servants had arranged his rooms. Servants had carried his belongings. Servants had answered his calls. Even during captivity in the Soviet Union, he had often received treatment far more comfortable than that of an ordinary prisoner. Now, daily life at Fuxin required something different. He had to learn how to care for himself. The change sounds almost absurdly small compared with the wars, revolutions, occupations, and collapsing empires that had shaped his life. But for Puyi, these ordinary tasks were revolutionary. He had to wash his own clothing. He had to fold his own bedding. He had to manage his personal possessions. He had to participate in routines that applied not only to him, but to everyone around him. For an ordinary adult, such things were unremarkable. For Puyi, they revealed just how unusual his life had been. The emperor who had once been unable to open a door without attendants now had to learn the movements of ordinary independence. He did not learn them gracefully. At first, fellow prisoners sometimes helped him. Some had served under him in Manchukuo. Old habits did not disappear simply because the setting had changed. Men who had once regarded him as their sovereign could still feel the weight of past hierarchy. And Puyi, despite everything that had happened, could still fall naturally into the expectation that someone else would take care of him. Years of behavior had hardened into instinct. The prison authorities wanted those instincts changed. Life at Fuxin included political study, written self-examination, group discussion, labor, and repeated efforts to force prisoners to reconsider their wartime actions. The process was part of the new government's broader system of ideological reform. Puyi was expected to examine the history he had spent years explaining in ways favorable to himself. This was not simply a private act of reflection. It took place within a prison system run by a revolutionary state that had strong expectations about how the past should be understood. Statements were demanded. Confessions were revised. Prisoners were encouraged to criticize themselves and one another. Puyi, therefore, did not encounter his past in a neutral environment. But even within that controlled setting, something significant began to happen. The story he had told about himself became harder to maintain. For years, Puyi had relied upon a simple explanation. He had been powerless. Others had controlled him. When he became emperor as a child, adults chose for him. When the Qing Dynasty fell, others negotiated his abdication. When he was restored briefly in 1917, generals created the restoration. When he was expelled from the Forbidden City, soldiers removed him. When he went to Manchuria, Japanese officers manipulated him. When he ruled Manchukuo, Japanese advisors controlled the government. When the state collapsed, Soviet troops captured him. There was truth in much of this. Puyi had repeatedly been used. But there was another truth beside it. He had wanted restoration. He had sought foreign protection. He had ignored warnings about Japanese intentions. He had traveled to Manchuria because he hoped to become a ruler again. He had accepted the position of chief executive. He had accepted the imperial title. He had signed documents. He had appeared publicly as the head of the state. He had remained there for more than a decade. He had not created the Japanese occupation. He had not commanded the Kwantung army. He had not controlled the most important decisions of Manchukuo. But neither had he been a completely passive object. The distinction was uncomfortable. It forced him toward a question he had spent much of his life avoiding. If a person has limited power, does he have no responsibility? And if he is manipulated by others, does that erase every choice he makes while being manipulated? There was no simple answer. That is what made the question painful. At Fushun, former officials who had served under Puyi could describe events from perspectives he had rarely heard. They had seen the machinery of the state beneath the ceremonies. They could discuss arrests, repression, forced policies, collaboration, fear, and the daily consequences of decisions made in the name of Manchukuo. Some had known far more about the suffering outside Puyi's palace than Puyi himself had known, or had allowed himself to know. The distance that had protected him now became evidence against his understanding of himself. For most of his life, Puyi had lived at the center of enclosed worlds. First, the Forbidden City, then the foreign concessions of Tianjin, then the imperial household in Manchukuo. Again and again, layers of attendants, officials, guards, and ceremony had separated him from ordinary people. He had known populations as abstractions, subjects, citizens, workers, soldiers, officials, prisoners. He had rarely needed to know them as individuals. At Fushun, that distance narrowed. Men ate near him, worked near him, argued with him, shared rooms with him, corrected him, sometimes criticized him. Nobody was required to treat his comfort as more important than everyone else's. There was no throne at the center of the room. This simple equality was perhaps more destabilizing than imprisonment itself. The old emperor had spent decades believing hierarchy was natural. Now the routines of prison insisted upon a radically different lesson. A bed was a bed. A meal was a meal. A uniform was a uniform. A man was expected to carry his share. Puyi gradually became better at ordinary tasks. He learned practical habits that should have been acquired in childhood. He began caring for his own things. He became less helpless in daily life. And somewhere in those repetitive routines, something unexpected happened. The loss of privilege began to create a kind of independence. This was not freedom in the political sense. He was still a prisoner. His movements were controlled. His future was uncertain. His ideological education was compulsory. But a man who can dress himself possesses one small freedom that a man surrounded by servants does not. A man who can complete an ordinary task without waiting for another person has learned something about self-reliance. For Puyi, the lesson came very late, but it came. The contrast with his childhood could hardly have been greater. In the Forbidden City, people had rushed forward if he dropped something. At Fushun, he could bend down and pick it up himself. In the palace, countless dishes had appeared before him. In prison, food was ordinary and shared according to routine. In the palace, he had been addressed with language that separated him from humanity. In prison, he possessed a name and a number within an institution. The Son of Heaven was learning how to become a person among persons. His transformation was neither sudden nor simple. Human beings do not discard 40 years of identity in a single moment. Puyi remained anxious about his fate. He had reason to be. Across the world after the Second World War, Leaders and collaborators associated with defeated regimes had been tried, imprisoned, and in some cases executed. Puyi knew that his role in Manchukuo could lead to severe punishment. For years, he feared that the Chinese government might eventually put him on trial and sentence him to death. This fear influenced his behavior. His confessions became more extensive. He wrote about his past. He tried to demonstrate that he was changing. He learned the political language expected within the new system. It would be naive to imagine that every statement produced in prison represented pure, spontaneous self-discovery. Survival was always present. So was pressure. So was ideology. But it would be equally simplistic to conclude that nothing within Puyi changed. By many accounts, his years in detention did alter the way he saw himself. Perhaps the clearest transformation was the collapse of his belief that he had been entitled to a throne. That idea had survived almost everything. It survived abdication. It survived the Republic. It survived expulsion from the Forbidden City. It survived years in Tianjin. It survived Japanese control. It survived the collapse of Manchukuo. Even during Soviet captivity, part of Puyi's old social identity remained intact. Fushun gradually stripped it away. He began to recognize that the imperial world of his childhood had not been merely beautiful and unfortunate. It had also distorted him. The servants who obeyed him had taught him dependence. The rituals that exalted him had prevented him from understanding equality. The people who insisted that he was destined to rule had encouraged ambitions others later exploited. The palace had imprisoned his body. The idea of being emperor had imprisoned his imagination. That realization may have been the deepest loss of all. A throne can be taken physically in a day. A belief taught from childhood can take decades to surrender. And as that belief weakened, Puyi had to ask who remained underneath it. Who was he if he was not emperor? Not Xuantong. Not Kangde. Not the heir of the Qing. Not a sovereign waiting for restoration. Just Puyi. For much of his life, that possibility had terrified him. Ordinary existence had seemed like humiliation. Now, ordinary existence began to appear differently. He watched people perform practical work. He saw value in usefulness rather than rank. He learned that a person could possess dignity without anyone kneeling before him. He became interested in gardening. There is something almost poetic about this development, although history rarely arranges symbols as neatly as storytellers would like. Puyi had grown up among imperial gardens designed for emperors. Their rocks, ponds, pavilions, flowers, and ancient trees had existed for his enjoyment. He had never needed to understand the patient labor that kept them alive. Now cultivation meant work. Soil had to be handled. Plants required attention. Growth could not be commanded. A seed did not care whether the hand planting it had once carried an imperial seal. A flower did not bow. It responded only to light, water, temperature, and time. Perhaps this was one of the gentlest lessons available to a man once taught that the universe revolved around him. Living things grow according to laws indifferent to titles. Years passed. China itself changed rapidly outside the prison walls. The new People's Republic consolidated power. Land reform transformed the countryside, often through violent political campaigns. Industry expanded. The Korean War brought China into direct military conflict with forces led by the United States. Political campaigns reshaped public life. Society was being reorganized on a scale Puyi could only observe indirectly from detention. Once again, China was becoming a new country while he remained behind walls. But this time, he no longer imagined that he would someday rule it. The dream had finally vanished. In 1959, after nearly a decade at Fushun, Puyi received astonishing news. He was to be pardoned. The People's Republic of China announced a special amnesty for a group of prisoners considered to have undergone sufficient reform. Puyi was among them. He was 53 years old. For the first time since infancy, he was about to enter Beijing without being an emperor, a protected aristocrat, a puppet ruler, or a prisoner. Just a citizen. Consider the distance he had traveled. A toddler carried through the gates of the Forbidden City. A child emperor watching a dynasty disappear. A young monarch preserved inside a republican capital. A teenager briefly restored. A young man expelled from his palace. An exile in Tianjin. A ruler installed in Manchuria. An emperor under Japanese power. A fugitive. A Soviet captive. A war crimes witness. A prisoner undergoing reform. And now, after half a century of extraordinary titles, Puyi was given perhaps the most unfamiliar status of his life. Ordinary freedom. No one could know whether he was prepared for it. The world outside Fushun bore little resemblance to the one he had known. The Qing Dynasty belonged to history books. The warlord era was gone. The Japanese Empire had disappeared from Manchuria. The Republic of China government had retreated to Taiwan. Beijing belonged to the People's Republic. The city had new flags, new institutions, new slogans, new neighborhoods, and new expectations. Even the Forbidden City had changed its meaning. It was no longer a royal residence. It was the Palace Museum. Visitors entered the grounds where Puyi had once lived behind locked gates. They walked across the courtyards. They looked at the halls. They examined imperial objects behind displays. They stood before the throne. The world that had taught Puyi it was eternal had become an exhibition. Soon, he would see this with his own eyes. He would return to Beijing without attendance. He would ride public transportation. He would work. He would learn the rhythms of ordinary urban life. And eventually, he would stand again inside the Forbidden City, not as its owner, not as its prisoner, but as one visitor among many. There could have been no more complete reversal. For most of his life, Puyi had feared becoming ordinary. In the end, ordinary life would become the closest thing to freedom he had ever known. The emperor had disappeared. The prisoner was about to disappear as well. What remained was a middle-aged man walking into a city that remembered him as history. And for the first time, there was no throne waiting anywhere ahead. When Puyi returned to Beijing in 1959, he came back to a city that no longer belonged to emperors. He arrived without an imperial procession. There were no yellow banners, no palace guards, no officials waiting on their knees, no sedan chair carried beneath ceremonial gates. He was 53 years old, newly pardoned after years of detention, and for the first time in his life, he was expected to live as an ordinary citizen. Perhaps no title Puyi ever received was stranger to him than that. Citizen. It was a small word compared with emperor, but it demanded much more from him. An emperor could exist through ceremony. A citizen had to exist through daily life. Puyi now had to learn how to travel through a city without an escort clearing the way. He had to understand money in practical terms. He had to find his own place in a crowd. He had to work. He had to move through streets where almost nobody was required to notice him. And Beijing itself had changed almost beyond recognition. The city of his childhood had been filled with walls and gates. The old imperial capital had been organized around layers of enclosure. Courtyard houses stretched through narrow lanes. City gates controlled movement. Palaces, temples, compounds, and private residences separated one social world from another. Rickshaws and carts had moved through dusty roads beneath the shadows of ancient towers. Now Beijing was the capital of the People's Republic of China. Red flags flew above government buildings. Political slogans appeared in public spaces. Bicycles filled the streets. Buses carried workers across the city. Factories and construction projects announced a new age. The language of society had changed. The values officially celebrated were no longer ancestry, imperial rank, and dynastic privilege, but labor, citizenship, revolution, and collective identity. Puyi had once been placed symbolically above hundreds of millions of people. Now he was expected to become one among them. There must have been moments when the simplest scenes felt extraordinary. Standing at a bus stop, walking into a shop, waiting his turn, crossing a busy street, watching workers return home at the end of the day, seeing families traveling together, hearing strangers speak without lowering their voices because an emperor was nearby. For most people, these experiences were invisible because they were ordinary. For Puyi, ordinary life was almost a foreign country. He had spent his childhood surrounded by hundreds of attendants. He had spent his young adulthood surrounded by royalists and political agents. He had spent the Manchukuo years beneath Japanese surveillance. He had spent his captivity under guards. At every stage of his life, someone had been watching him. Now, strangely, freedom meant that people could pass him without caring who he was. Perhaps that was one of its greatest gifts. Puyi went to live with members of his family. The former imperial clan itself had been transformed. The enormous network of princes, nobles, dependents, servants, and retainers associated with the Qing court had disappeared as a political institution. Relatives who might once have occupied privileged compounds now lived under a completely different social order. Family relationships no longer existed within the same ceremonial structure that had shaped Puyi's childhood. He was no longer someone before whom relatives were expected to behave as subjects. He was simply an older member of a family that had survived the disappearance of the world into which it had been born. Soon, Puyi was given work at the Beijing Botanical Garden. The position has become one of the most remembered images from the final period of his life. The last emperor became a gardener. It sounds almost too perfect. A storyteller might have invented it. But history sometimes produces its own symbols. Imagine Puyi arriving in the morning. The air is cool. Leaves move gently above pathways. There is soil beneath his shoes rather than polished palace stone. There are no dragons carved into the walls. No throne room waits nearby. Instead, there are plants, young shoots, shrubs, flowers, trees, beds of earth requiring water and attention. The work is quiet. Nothing in a garden responds to ancestry. No plant grows faster because the person watering it was once called the son of heaven. No tree recognizes a former emperor. A branch does not bow. A flower does not flatter. Living things require patience rather than command. For someone whose earliest lessons had taught him that desire should immediately become obedience, gardening offered another kind of education. Water cannot be ordered to arrive after the soil has already dried. A season cannot be hurried. Roots grow unseen. Leaves open according to their own rhythm. The gardener does not rule the garden. He participates in it. Perhaps this is why the image of Puyi among plants feels so fitting. His entire life had been shaped by people trying to control history. The Qing court had tried to preserve an ancient order. Republican politicians had tried to build new institutions. Warlords had tried to control regions with armies. Japanese officers had tried to construct an empire in Manchuria. Revolutionaries had tried to create a completely different society. Puyi himself had spent decades trying to recover a throne. But a garden teaches that some transformations cannot be commanded. They must simply be allowed to happen over time. And time had transformed him. The boy who once screamed for servants now carried out assigned work. The young man who dreamed of restoration now lived without a court. The emperor who had possessed warehouses of imperial treasures now received an ordinary wage. The prisoner who had feared execution now walked under open skies. His life had become smaller. But for perhaps the first time, that smallness belonged partly to him. There was dignity in being useful. There was freedom in having responsibilities that did not depend upon pretending to possess power. Of course, Puyi did not become an ordinary man in the sense that his past disappeared. It could never disappear. People knew who he was. His history followed him. He remained politically and historically significant. The state itself took an interest in presenting his transformation as evidence that even a former emperor and wartime collaborator could be reformed into a citizen of the new society. Puyi therefore remained in some ways a symbol. History had used him as a symbol when he was 3 years old. It used him as a symbol again in Manchukuo. And even after his pardon, his life could still serve a larger political narrative. The difference was that Puyi now seemed more willing to accept that his identity did not require sovereignty. He later worked in connection with the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, where he contributed to historical and literary work. For a man who had once lived at the center of events without fully understanding them, there was something remarkable about being asked to look backward and describe what had happened. Memory became a form of labor. He began writing and revising the account of his life that would eventually become his autobiography, commonly known in English as From Emperor to Citizen. The book was shaped by the political environment in which it was produced. Like nearly every autobiography, it was also shaped by memory, hindsight, self-justification, regret, and the desire to create meaning from events that had once seemed chaotic. But it remains an extraordinary document. Few human beings have been forced to describe such a complete reversal of status. Puyi could remember being worshipped. He could remember servants kneeling. He could remember imperial ceremonies. He could remember Japanese officers controlling his government. He could remember capture. He could remember prison. And now he could sit at a desk in modern Beijing and write about the child who had once believed himself different from everyone else. The distance between the writer and the child was half a century. But sometimes the red walls of memory must have seemed very close. In 1962, Puyi married again. His wife was Li Shuxian, a hospital nurse. This marriage was unlike the dynastic unions of his youth. She was not selected as an empress. There was no imperial court arranging noble families around a succession. No elaborate palace bureaucracy was required. She was a working woman in the People's Republic. He was a former emperor living as a citizen. Their marriage represented something Puyi had almost never possessed in earlier life: a domestic relationship without an imperial institution surrounding it. It was not a fairy tale. Puyi's health was increasingly fragile, and the burdens of his past could not simply disappear. But there was a profound difference between living beside a wife, because dynastic ritual required an empress, and sharing a home, because two adults had entered an ordinary marriage. The ordinary had once frightened Puyi. Now it offered a kind of peace. Perhaps the most powerful transformation of all concerned the Forbidden City. The palace of Puyi's childhood was still standing. Its red walls remained. Its yellow roofs still caught the sunlight. The marble terraces remained beneath the great halls. Bronze lions still guarded gates. Ancient trees still grew in quiet corners. Visitors could still cross the courtyards where imperial officials had once stood. But the Forbidden City was no longer forbidden. It had become the Palace Museum. The name alone contained the entire story. A palace is a place where power lives. A museum is a place where the remains of another time are observed. The throne still existed, but nobody governed from it. The great halls still existed, but officials no longer waited there for imperial audiences. The imperial treasures were no longer simply possessions of a ruling household. They belonged to historical collections, and ordinary people could enter. They could buy a ticket. They could walk through gates that generations of common people had been forbidden to cross. They could stand before the architectural symbols of imperial authority and then continue walking. Imagine what this reversal meant for Puyi. As a boy, he had lived inside the palace and longed to leave. As an older man, he could approach it from outside like everyone else. The walls that had once separated the emperor from humanity had become walls surrounding a public historical site. The palace had outlived the political world that gave it meaning. Buildings often do. They survive their owners. Stone survives ideology. Wooden halls can be repaired after generations have forgotten the names of the servants who swept them. A throne can remain intact long after the command spoken from it has lost all force. Perhaps Puyi understood this better than most. He himself had become something like the palace, a living remnant of a vanished age. People could look at him and see 1908, the Qing Dynasty, the final years of imperial China, Manchukuo, the Japanese occupation, the Soviet invasion, the early People's Republic. His body carried a remarkable portion of modern Chinese history within one lifetime. But he was not merely an exhibit. He still had mornings, meals, work, conversations, illnesses, small pleasures, ordinary concerns. This was the quiet miracle of his final years. History had not completely swallowed the man. For a while, Puyi was allowed simply to live. He did not live very long after his pardon. By the middle of the 1960s, his health was deteriorating. He suffered from kidney illness and other medical problems. China, meanwhile, was entering another turbulent period. In 1966, the Cultural Revolution began. Political campaigns spread through schools, workplaces, institutions, neighborhoods, and families. Symbols of the old society came under intense attack. Traditional culture, former elites, officials, intellectuals, and people associated with disfavored backgrounds could become targets. For a former emperor, the atmosphere could hardly have been reassuring. Puyi represented in one person almost everything the revolution claimed to have replaced. Yet by then, he was also officially presented as a reformed citizen. He had already participated in the new political system. He had written about his transformation, and his declining health increasingly narrowed his world. The final chapter of his life would not be played out on a battlefield. There would be no last palace conspiracy. No army would come to restore him. No foreign power would offer another throne. The great dramas were over. What remained was illness, hospitals, family concern, a weakened body, and time. Puyi died in Beijing on October 17, 1967. He was 61 years old. The last emperor of China died not in an imperial palace, but as a citizen of a republic built upon the ruins of the political world into which he had been born. There was no imperial succession. No child was chosen to inherit the mandate of heaven. No officials gathered to choose a reign name for a new monarch. No dynastic announcement traveled across the provinces. The line ended quietly. The throne remained empty. And perhaps this is where we should leave Puyi. Not at his coronation. Not in the uniform of Manchukuo. Not beneath Japanese flags. Not behind prison walls. But somewhere in Beijing during those final ordinary years. Perhaps on a cool morning. The city is already awake. Bicycles pass along the road. A bus slows at a stop. Workers move toward offices and factories. Someone carries vegetables home from a market. Children hurry along beside their parents. Among them walks a bespectacled man in simple clothing. Most people continue past him. Some may recognize his face. Many may not. He does not need them to kneel. The morning does not change because he once sat on a dragon throne. He is simply moving through the city with everyone else. And somewhere nearby, behind enormous red walls, stands the Forbidden City. The sunlight reaches the yellow tiles, just as it did when he was a child. Visitors cross the stone courtyards. Their footsteps echo beneath old gates. They move through the Hall of Supreme Harmony and look toward the throne where generations of emperors claimed authority beneath heaven. Perhaps they pause for a moment. Perhaps they imagine ceremonies, banners, incense, and silk. Perhaps they try to picture the little boy who was carried into that world in 1908. He was not yet 3 years old. He did not understand the words whispered around him. He did not understand why grown men were kneeling. He did not know that the dynasty beneath him was already dying. He could not know that he would lose the throne, regain a shadow of it, lose it again, cross empires, survive wars, become a prisoner, and finally return to the same city as an ordinary man. All he knew was that he had been taken away from home. And perhaps, beneath everything that came afterward, that frightened child never entirely disappeared. Puyi spent much of his life trying to recover a world that adults had told him was his birthright. But the Qing world could not be recovered. Neither could childhood. Neither could the illusion that history would reverse itself if he waited long enough. One by one, those things were taken from him. The dynasty, the palace, the title, the second throne, the state, the servants, the protection of foreign powers, even the belief that he was fundamentally different from other people. And only when almost everything had disappeared did Puyi acquire something he had possessed very little of as an emperor. A life measured in his own small actions. Watering a plant, going to work, sharing a home, writing a page, walking down a street, waiting among strangers, being addressed by a name rather than a sacred title. There is a temptation to call this redemption. History is rarely so simple. Puyi made choices with serious consequences. He collaborated with a Japanese-sponsored regime. He lived at the ceremonial center of a system that brought suffering to millions. His lack of full political power does not erase his participation. Nor should the later story of reform make the earlier history disappear. But neither does responsibility require us to deny the strange forces that shaped him. He was made into a political symbol before he knew what politics was. He was taught an illusion before he could question it. He spent decades trying to inhabit a role that had already ceased to belong to the modern world. He was used because he wanted to be used in precisely the way others found useful. And when the illusion finally collapsed, he was left with the difficult task of discovering the person beneath the role. That is why Puyi's life feels larger than the story of one fallen emperor. It is also a story about power. About what power looks like from the outside and what it feels like when someone else controls the room behind the throne. It is a story about identity. About what happens when a person is told from childhood that one title explains his entire existence. It is a story about historical change. About how quickly institutions that seem eternal can become memories. And perhaps most of all, it is a story about the difference between possessing a world and belonging to one. Puyi was told as a child that the empire belonged to him. It did not. He was told that the throne defined him. It did not. He believed Japan could restore what history had taken away. It could not. Only much later, when the palaces and armies were gone, did he begin to participate in the ordinary human world around him. And so, as our story comes to its end, imagine one final evening over Beijing. The light is fading. The last warmth of the day rests on the roofs of the Forbidden City. Golden tiles turn darker beneath the evening sky. The great courtyards slowly empty. Visitors move toward the gates. Their voices become distant. A breeze passes beneath painted eaves. Somewhere, a bird settles into an ancient tree. The throne room grows quiet. No emperor will sleep there tonight. No eunuch will carry a lantern through the corridor. No official will wait for the morning audience. The stones remember nothing. The walls explain nothing. They simply remain. And in the gathering darkness, it is possible to imagine the faint outline of a small child crossing one of those enormous courtyards. His robes are too heavy. The halls are too large. The crown belongs to a world he cannot understand. Everyone around him calls him emperor, but he is only a boy. A boy who will spend nearly all his life losing the things other people told him he possessed. Until, near the end, there is almost nothing left to lose. No empire, no throne, no sacred title, only a man beneath an open sky. And perhaps that was the first world that truly belonged to Puyi, not because he ruled it, but because, at last, he was simply allowed to live within it. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of tonight's story here on Ancient Stories to Sleep. If this quiet journey through history helped you relax, unwind, or drift a little closer to sleep, we would be grateful for your support. Please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with someone who also enjoys calm stories from the past. Your support allows us to keep bringing forgotten lives, vanished worlds, and gentle historical journeys into the stillness of the night. And wherever you are listening from, may the rest of your evening be peaceful, your thoughts be light, and your sleep be deep. Until our next journey into history, good night, and thank you for listening.